what's new in building codes? So we're in a regulatory moment. We have an unprecedented amount of commitment, ambition, and action merging around building codes right now in Canada. That means it's time for advocates, industry, and all levels of government to work together and to build on this momentum and rapidly cut building sector energy emissions and set each building on a path to net zero. Over the next few slides, we'll walk through what some of these commitments are, what some of the actions are, and how they align with the release of the model codes and how they fit into the codes landscape as well. This includes the release of the 2020 model codes, building codes and standards on the horizon, and also other notable activities and announcements that impact the building sector and the implementation of the 2020 model codes. So in Canada, this might be a little bit repetitive, but in Canada, building codes are developed by the Canadian Commission on Building and Fire Codes. Policy direction is set by the provinces and territories. And codes development, implementation, adoption, and compliance are supported by the National Research Council, as well as NRCan in terms of technical support. Building codes come into force of law when they're adopted by the province or territory. And in the past, this has played out differently in each province. Some provinces quickly or automatically adopt the latest codes available. Others, like Quebec and BC, develop their own codes. Ontario adapts the national model codes, while others have adopted codes at a pace that suits their local market. With the 2020 model codes, we're on a new path. So through the 2017 Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, provinces and territories committed to adopting net zero energy ready codes by 2030. So that's a short eight-year window from now to reach that top step. However, with the release of the model codes this past March, we now have in place a framework to meet that goal. So tiered codes are relatively new to Canada, and they act as a roadmap for industry. The 2020 model codes offer a series of performance tiers that set a clear and predictable path towards 2030. At which point, each new building is expected to be so energy efficient that it can easily supply its own energy needs with either on-site renewable generation or off-site clean energy. In this way, the tiered codes provide both the time and the direction required to build capacity in the market over the coming years. This means they offer predictability and certainty for where we're going and a timeline for when. The intent behind this is to help builders, developers, and the workforce, as well as manufacturers, prepare to meet the market's needs. So for a province like Manitoba, we were speaking in the opening, there's that time to invest in the province's future. It also offers flexibility for authorities having jurisdiction. So typically the municipalities to adopt more stringent tiers earlier than their peers. And this approach has helped the BC Energy Subcode, as Bob will share, enjoy broad uptake. Neighboring communities benefit from a positive spillover effect. Those who adopt the upper tiers earlier act as catalysts and encourage neighboring municipalities to do the same. Tiered codes also help coordinate the development and implementation of provincial, municipal, and utility energy efficiency and carbon reduction strategies. This means that those policies, programs, and incentives can follow the well-defined tiers of the 2020 model codes. This leads to greater coordination of standards and fewer jurisdictional barriers. Certainty paired with flexibility helps to de-risk adoption for all levels of government, industry, building owners, and all stakeholders in the sector. It also helps reduce complexity related to compliance. However, to reap the full benefits of the tiered code framework, each jurisdiction must make the full suite of tiers available and accessible for industry, utilities, and building owners. We spoke a little bit again in the prelude about how other provinces are approaching adoption. And so far, the early example that we have is Ontario, which will adopt a single tier of each, the NECB and the NBC, National Building Codes, a single tier to the exclusion of all others. And so basically foregoing this roadmap benefit that the tiered codes have. So what are the tiers? Starting with the NECB. NECB 2020 is approximately equivalent to NECB 2017. However, as you're aware, Manitoba is currently on NECB 2011, so it has to make this jump from 2011 to 2017, or sorry, 2020. The jump from 2011 to 2017 itself is about a 10 to 15% increase in energy performance. And this increase is largely driven by increased envelope requirements, as well as performance requirements that were introduced to complement the prescriptive requirements. NECB 2017 to 2020 continues this trend. There's relatively minor changes in several areas that introduce or refine procedures for voluntary air tightness testing, update equipment performance tables, namely in hot water heating and HVAC, and also improve the thermal characteristics of the building envelope. And of course, there's the tiers. There's 4 tiers in the NECB. Tier 1 requirements are equal to those of NECB 2017. Tiers 2 to 4, the energy performance levels are meant to be within reach of current practices and technologies. Meanwhile, Tier 4 targets generally meet or exceed ASHRAE targets for net zero energy ready. As we'll see in the NBC, there's additional envelope requirements in the National Building Code. These aren't carried over to the NECB. In the NECB, no compliance paths were removed, but instead there's now a tiered performance compliance path added. So there's now a total of 4 compliance paths added or in the NECB. These are the prescriptive trade-off, performance, and the tiered performance path. Moving on to the National Building Code. So there's five tiers within the National Building Code. Again, tier 1 is roughly equal to section 936 of NBC 2015. And tiers 2 to 5 follow, again, roughly voluntary standards, starting at tier 2 of Energy Star R2000 and the CHVA's Net Zero Energy Ready label. In addition to the performance path, there's also a prescriptive path. It's based on 4 tiers. So as you can see on the slide, there's 5. This is the performance path. In the prescriptive path, there's 4 tiers. Tier 1 being the base code offers there's no points required to achieve that. Starting at tier 2, there's 10 points required. These are energy conservation points. And tiers 3 and 4 are expected to be completed in the next code cycle. Again, using the example of Ontario's adoption process and their proposed adoption measures, they've added 30 points to tier 3. So where there is no points in the national model codes, they've offered 30. And these can be achieved through things like improved air tightness, higher performing HRVs, higher efficiency service water heaters, and also smaller house size. For both the NECB and the NBC, neither the base nor the tier performance levels are expected to change in future code cycles. This means that instead of more regulation, the tiered codes are clear regulation. They set the direction for industry, and they set a long-term goal of net zero energy ready buildings. And by doing so, they encourage innovative processes and practices to meet those goals. So moving on to harmonization, a key driver behind the adoption of 2020 model codes is harmonization. There's a desire on the part of provinces and territories to harmonize their building codes with the national model codes. And that's really what's driving this round of code adoption. Harmonization is expected to reduce variations between different jurisdictions, as well as make it easier and less costly for industry, manufacturers, and suppliers to meet the needs of the construction industry. Each of the provinces have now committed to a harmonization agreement. And as part of that agreement, we'll implement the 2020 national codes within 24 months of their publication and implement future codes within 18 months of publication. 3 main goals related to harmonization include reducing variations in technical requirements between each of the provinces and territories, and ensuring consistent and timely adoption of the codes, and shaping or reshaping the national code development system to better meet the needs of provinces and territories. Tiered codes play an important role in advancing harmonization, as through the tiers, a province, a territory, or in some jurisdictions, a municipality can adopt a tier that meets their unique needs. This includes the capacity, the workforce readiness, and availability of resources of their local market. But meanwhile, we all continue to work towards a shared goal, which is the net zero energy ready standard. Early adopters, again, whether they be provinces or territories or leading municipalities, act as catalysts. So lessons learned from their adoption of the upper tiers can then be shared with others. And that's another lesson that we can take from the BC Energy Subcode. So shortly after the code's release in mid-December, or sorry, I should say after the announcement of the code's release in mid-December, the federal government announced through the ministerial cabinet letters new roles and responsibilities for the ministers of natural resources, as well as the Minister of Innovation, Science, Industry, and Economic Development. The mandate letters assigned for the first time ministerial oversight over codes development and implementation. The mandate included publishing a net zero emissions building code, as well as a model retrofit code by 2024. Now, the language within the mandate letters signaled some significant changes. First, of course, it added emissions as a goal within model code development. And this changes from a previously somewhat narrow definition on energy efficiency to now include emissions. Second, it, of course, directs the model retrofit code to be developed by 2024. The net zero emissions code is a new and welcome addition. It aligns with the international agency's net zero scenario, which urges governments to act before 2025 to ensure zero carbon ready compliant building codes are implemented. There's a relatively short window for the development of a net zero emissions code, but from Efficiency Canada's perspective, it should feature passive design features, a robust building envelope, and highly energy efficient equipment and appliances. Each of these measures helps to reduce the building's energy demand, allows for right-sized renewable energy systems, and in effect lessens the building's energy demands. This code is an opportunity to tackle operational emissions immediately. And meanwhile, the emissions code can also address embodied emissions by raising awareness of how the role emissions play in the building sector and building materials, while also building the knowledge infrastructure needed to account for emissions in construction materials. So namely, this would be supporting a mature life cycle assessment and an environmental product declaration framework. So moving on, let's look at the AEB as it has close ties to the adoption of the 2020 model codes. So, I'll explain the slide first. This is our from the Provincial Energy Efficiency Scorecard, Efficiency Canada's scorecard, and just highlight some of the compliance activities, which I'll come to in a moment. So the adoption of stringent energy codes for new building can accelerate the development and the adoption of a model code for existing buildings. This is because a model code for existing buildings follows much of the same path as its new building counterpart. This process is already underway, and provinces and territories see the alterations to existing building codes as one of the highest priorities. And given the name, I'll refer to it as the AEB moving forward. It's expected to be a tiered approach and offer prescriptive and performance compliance paths. We'll hopefully have air tightness as a central feature, and more closely focus on climate change mitigation and adaptation. It also opens the door to conversations about different metrics, including energy use intensity and TEDI targets. The AEB itself will be triggered by voluntary measures. This means that the building owner will voluntarily undertake renovations, and then these may trigger additional energy performance requirements. In our analysis, we believe that the voluntary nature of the AEB is unlikely to move at the pace and scale that we need to draw down emissions from existing buildings quickly. As such, we've recommended building performance standards to more quickly address emissions from the worst performing buildings. These would target those buildings that fall below a specified performance range for example, an average or a median performance of the building stock or a segment of the building stock. So again, they can be highly targeted. All the same, the AEB will reshape how Canadians approach retrofits. And adoption of the 2020 model codes can help pave the way for the retrofit code. Building energy codes that improve the performance of new buildings are an ideal way to introduce skills, techniques, and processes that will also be needed to retrofit our aging building stock. Stringent energy codes and emissions codes for new buildings, together with building energy labeling, workforce training, and the AEB, as well as building performance standards, are all critical to reducing energy use and emissions in the building sector. Now, of course, how effectively the code framework does so depends on a robust compliance regime. Oh, I think I skipped a slide. So here we are at compliance all the same. So of course, a building code is only effective as compliance enforcement. And this is another reason the federal mandate letter was important. It included language to ensure effective implementation of building codes. So this means, and part of the language was working with partners to develop strategies around incentives, training programs, and pilot initiatives. This demonstrates recognition that accelerating building code adoption, enforcement, and compliance all depend on federal action to spur market readiness. So again, Efficiency Canada's research suggests that a net zero building code acceleration fund is needed to support these activities. And this would all include activities that reduce the financial impact of code compliance. This includes things like checklists and templates for building officials, funding for building energy managers to help with compliance, as well as resources for programs that address cost and affordability concerns or technical challenge. And I think, again, we can look at NRCan's local energy efficiency partnerships, the LEAP program, as one of the tools that we can use to address those costs and affordability and technical concerns. A net zero building code acceleration fund would also include development of builder field guides and building science guidance that would help reduce or at least help mitigate some of the complexity of higher performing buildings. In total, a net zero acceleration fund would de-risk adoption and encourage greater compliance enforcement for provinces, municipalities, industry, and consumers. So coming to the slide, as we can see in the 2021 Provincial Energy Efficiency Scorecard, Manitoba did do quite well, third place in terms of compliance through things like utility involvement and compliance tools. Now, it's well positioned to continue to support compliance and build on these supports with training and technical assistance, as well as gathering feedback from stakeholders through things like compliance studies. This will also serve to help Manitoba adopt a higher tier, to take bolder action and adopt one of the upper tiers of the 2020 model codes. So in terms of the activities around model codes that are important, one of those was the net zero emissions, 2030 emissions reduction plan. That was released at the end of March of this year. The plan lays out actions to cut Canada's emissions to almost half by 2030 from 2005 levels. Buildings are central to the emissions reduction plan. This is made clear in the ERP's overview section, which leads with the line, helping to reduce energy costs for our homes and buildings. Reading between the lines here, it's clear the government has now recognized energy efficiency is important for both an affordable and a just transition to net zero emissions. So by the same name, the plan also includes a net zero building code acceleration fund. A dollar figure hasn't yet been assigned to this fund, but itself is part of a broader green building strategy. This strategy is intended to help encourage provincial building code adoption activities, as well as improve federal capacity and technical support for the development, as well as the adoption of net zero the adoption of the net zero emissions code and the alteration to existing building codes. So this is our regulatory moment. Each province soon has in place tiered codes. This will mean that we have a clear regulatory path that leads our building sector to net zero ready, energy ready by 2030. And on top of this framework, a plan to address operational and embodied emissions in both new and existing buildings. So the question is, what do we do at this moment? In addition to urging the swift development of a net zero emissions code and a retrofit code, we're at the starting point for their eventual incorporation into our codes framework. We also need to continue supporting building code adoption as well as compliance. In terms of adoption, we can look at adopting the full suite of tiers. These, as mentioned, act as a roadmap to where we're going and play a critical role in that. Also, the adoption of the upper tiers, and so Manitoba could look at leveraging its strengths to adopt an ambitious tier that helps it move to net zero energy ready by 2030. So, for example, adopting tier 3 would leave two more, on the residential side, would leave 2 more code jumps or to achieve within 8 years. And also, adopting the upper tiers would also require support for industry to deliver on increased energy performance safely and affordably. It's worth considering addendums to the code, although we have the harmonization agreement, either at the provincial level or the municipal level. We can have things like zero carbon heating and hot water systems in all new buildings, already occurring in places like Vancouver and Montreal. And we can also provide early support for code compliance. And so, again, looking at Manitoba and the energy efficiency or the provincial scorecard, things like increasing capacity amongst energy advisors in the province. So thank you very much. And I'll pass it over to Bob now.
Maybe a little bit about my background. I am a custom home builder and renovator on the south coast of British Columbia, based out of Whistler, British Columbia. So you may all be wondering, what is a small custom home builder and renovator doing presenting on the energy step code? So a little bit more about my background beyond being a custom home builder. Somehow I seem to have put myself in a position where I have ended up in a place where I have put a lot of time into codes development, both provincially and nationally. I currently am the co-vice chair for the Energy Step Code Council in British Columbia, and that was an extension of the role that I had in the development of the step code, both in terms of being part of the committee that developed the metrics and the strategy behind the Energy Step Code, and also the implementation strategy. And I also sit on the standing committee for energy efficiency with Codes Canada, and am just about to take on the chair role for the task groups to develop the prescriptive standards for Part 9 buildings for steps 3, 4, and 5, as well as I will be chairing the committee that's looking at the alterations to existing buildings for Part 9. And as Kevin noted, we have an ambitious target to try and establish a code for alterations to existing buildings by 2024. So I've spent a lot of time on this. And so, be great to share with you guys and girls some of the journey that BC had in getting to where we ended up with a score of 3 out of 3. That was pretty impressive. So just a little bit of a background on, what led to the successful implementation of a step code in British Columbia, because it really has been, I think, a very successful 3 years, 4 years so far in terms of adoption. And it really did start with the process that the government used to develop the step code in the first place. It was a very inclusive engagement to determine, how are we going to go about this? What were we going to measure? Borrowing from the stepped approach that California had first used and adopting it specifically to British Columbia. That inclusive engagement included individuals from every aspect of buildings and construction across the province. There was representatives from municipalities, from industry, both in terms of Part 3 buildings and Part 9 buildings. It involved people like me who were already in the high performance space and really understood how to do that, as well as people who had not yet dipped their toe in the water of high performance. We had the utilities there. We had building owner associations. We had architects. We had engineers, both on the structural side and the geoscientist side. And it was well facilitated, and everybody responded well, and everybody put a lot of time into it. We actually developed both the step code framework itself and an implementation strategy in less than 18 months. So as we look forward to some aggressive goals, say for alterations to existing buildings by 2024, I think, with the right people in the right places, the right level of engagement, you can make it happen. Another key part of the success was just the effort that was made, led, I think, in a large part by BC Housing, to step up and deliver education. We understood that capacity building was going to be key to this. So capacity was both in terms of having the people in place, because of course in British Columbia, we have a performance-based approach, recognizing that the national code, both for Part 3 and Part 9, so NECD for Part 3 and MBC for Part 9, will also offer a prescriptive path. We don't have time today to get into the vagaries of those two different approaches, but in BC, we are fully committed to that performance path. And of course, an energy advisor who can do the modeling is a key partner in all of this. In looking to be successful, the province did conduct a very detailed capacity study to try and understand, where were we starting and where did we had to get to. And then, of course, successful support network, which is really the Energy Step Code Council. And I can talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. So, what were some of the strategies that the province used for success? So, continuing on that theme of education, we had BC Housing, we had BC Hydro, we had Fortis. Everybody stepped forward to provide funding to make sure that education could be both delivered and then education could be developed and then it could be delivered. Because it's one thing to create education outcomes, but it's another thing to try and get that education out to builders, to municipalities, and to everybody who's involved in, building better buildings. So at the very early stages before the step code was really being adopted by municipalities, BC Housing took out a traveling roadshow, and they went to every major municipality in the province to deliver an overview of what is the BC Energy Step Code, how is it going to impact you, what are the things that you need to do to get prepared for this and that sort of thing. And so by creating that open engagement, it really did, in the early stages, start to alleviate some anxiety and fear over some of the changes that were coming. One of the other things that really positioned British Columbia for successful adoption is in BC, we do have mandatory builder licensing to build new houses. And about 6 years ago, we also included mandatory education as a component part of builder licensing. So today, to maintain your builder license, you are required to collect a certain number of continuing professional development credits every year. And some of those credits now, as I'll note a little bit later on, have to be focused on Energy Step Code, the information around Energy Step Code. The way the Step Code is approached, as Kevin noted, is it creates this stepped approach. And when the Step Code was initially released to the province, there was an option for municipalities to voluntarily adopt steps either 1 through 3 generally. And so what it allowed municipalities to do in just simply adopting step 1 would be for them to get not only the builders, the energy advisors, and the authority having jurisdiction, everybody in planning and the building department, to start to understand, how does a performance path approach work? And then we had this strategy for engagement, which, in the early stages, as I noted on the first slide, brought all the key players together, not only to help develop the framework for the Energy Step Code, but I think almost, or even more importantly, was how is this going to be implemented, and what's the timeline, and getting everybody on the same page, and creating a consensus around how is this going to work best for the province. And then, of course, as an extension of the development of the Step Code, we created the Energy Step Code Council. Pre-COVID, we were meeting face-to-face, I think at least 3-4 times a year. And it was a place for everybody to sit around a table, talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of what was going on. And then, we had a provincial government led by the Building Policy Safety Standards Branch that manages the code in British Columbia, who was very open to listening to the things that weren't working. And we had very, very flexible to create some changes in real time to address some of the key concerns that came forward. What are some of the highlights of the experience over the last 5 years? So in 2010, the province had initially adopted a higher level of energy efficiency, which was a monumental failure, really. And in part, there was no consultation with industry around how they were going to set this up, and there was no feedback loop. And so, interestingly, at that time, the city of Vancouver had moved to a performance-based approach where people were required to do blower-door tests and submit energy models. And it became pretty clear right out of the gate that the expectations that had been set in the 2010 code were not being met. And in fact, as we started to model houses that were being built to the 2010 code, it became clear that not only were we not meeting the standard, the new standard that had been set, we were actually underperforming on the basic 936 principles that we thought we had already achieved. We had municipalities such as Vancouver, North Vancouver, West Vancouver, Whistler, that already had homes that were being built to higher standards, because all of those municipalities had their own programs in place to require higher levels of energy efficiency, whether it was for density bonusing or for specific developments. And so that was certainly one of the things that in the Lower Mainland, where we build more than 70% of all the houses in the province, that was helping both on the education side as well as developing the capacity for one of these key players in a successful adoption of a performance-based code, which is our energy advisors. We had regions of the province that had not had a lot of experience with high performance buildings, such as Kamloops and Kelowna. So builders who were not experienced with performance-based codes or energy modeling, and were very, very suspicious of some of the costing data that the province had put out, because early in the phase, there was a recognition, if we don't really understand the cost of this, then people are going to be very, very reluctant to adopt a new standard. And so the province made a huge effort and actually performed the largest costing study on construction that I think had ever been produced. And of course, easy to look at that costing study as a builder and say, well, those aren't my costs. Those are somebody else's costs, and they have nothing to do with how I build. And so, that did result in some very aggressive lobbying from builder groups against adoption of the STEP code in the early days. But interestingly, in being able to bring those people to the Energy STEP Code Council, getting them to vocalize the things that weren't working for them, being able to make some changes, being able to, through the education initiatives that I had noted earlier before, very, very quickly able to get people turned around, show them, some simple paths to compliance, get them started on doing some air tightness testing, and very, very quickly on some of those large central builder groups got things turned around, and we turned people who were very, very negative to this into some true champions. One of the other highlights, as I noted before, is really looking for metrics that worked in the real world. The initial framework around some of the metrics that were developed, particularly the TEDI, we quickly discovered that as you went from the boundary of one climate zone to the other, that we had some real inconsistencies that were super frustrating for some of the builders. And so within about a 6-month period, we were able to adjust those metrics to address the concerns as a result of those lessons learned. So again, you know, that just helped with the engagement of the building community. They recognize that, you know, we understand it's not perfect, but we're here to listen and we'll make changes as required. And I think, you know, as we look at a model code coming nationally, that is really an umbrella of, you know, what that group felt would work best from C to C, from climate zone to climate zone, as a province, really understanding that, you know, we're going to adopt this, but we need to understand what works best for us. There is, you know, an ability within the agreement that the province has had to tweak the model national code so that you can really adopt this such that it, you know, it fits the way that, you know, people in Manitoba live and build houses. And so the last line I have here is, and this is pre-COVID because I haven't been able to update this, but as of 2020, we actually had 57 local governments who had adopted the energy step code before the province mandated. And in fact, the step code will not be brought into, the province is not going to regulate a level in the step code until December of this year. So we are still in this voluntary pathway where municipalities are free to adopt anywhere from step 1 technically until step 3. There are a few local governments who had previously already demonstrated an ability within their community to build this higher levels of the step code. For example, Whistler and the District of North Vancouver already had energy efficiency programs in place for bonus density that were at net zero or passive house. And so some of those municipalities and West Vancouver as well. So they already have requirements today for step 4 and step 5. And yes, the province in British Columbia will move to step 3 in December. So just, you know, a few important considerations as we look back on the journey here in British Columbia. One, you know, it's only successful if the products that everybody needs to address these higher levels of energy efficiency are available, you know, off the shelf. You know, one of the things I did note is that Duxton is a sponsor here, and so you already have a window manufacturer locally who can build high performance windows that can really be impactful in meeting those no energy standards. You know, looking at risk management, so you know, understand the costing that is based on optimized solutions for specific climate zones. You know, I would highly encourage Manitoba to reach over to British Columbia. I think that the province, BC Housing, the utilities would be very open to share, you know, the costing data that we've done, the education materials that have been created, the builder manuals around high performance walls and roofs. All that stuff is available for a very small cost. So any builder, any municipality, anybody can just go onto the BC Housing website and purchase all that stuff or borrow from the work that's already being done, understanding that certainly the costing data and a lot of that analysis is specific to BC, but be very helpful in just starting to inform, you know, what the expectation might be in Manitoba. British Columbia is somewhat unique in that we have every climate zone in one province. And so we do have data and analysis from climate zone 4 all the way to climate zone 8. So, you know, recognizing that Manitoba is, I believe, climate zone 6 and up, we do have information that is very specific to the climate zones that, you know, most of your builders are building in. You know, that just understanding the technical requirements, you know, trades, particularly mechanical, included in the education outreach. You know, one of the learning outcomes that we've had in British Columbia and, you know, in some parts of Canada is how important proper mechanical sizing is in the successful adoption of energy efficiency. As you make your houses more airtight and you improve the thermal performance of the house, the mechanical equipment needs to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And getting your HVAC contractors on board I think that's one of the biggest struggles that we've had is trying to make mechanical contractors understand how important the proper sizing of equipment is as we make houses more energy efficient. I noted on product availability. So, one of the advantages that we had is in the Lower Mainland, there were, many window manufacturers that were already either building windows to the passive house standard, so windows under a U value of 1, or we're in the product development. And so we can buy windows from a multitude of manufacturers, whether you want vinyl windows, fiberglass windows, or wood windows, all with E values under 1. We don't have to go offshore to get that stuff. And then, technical support, building capacity for energy advisors and blower door tests is critical. While the model national code will offer both a prescriptive and a performance path, I can't encourage you enough to educate yourselves in your building industry around the advantages of a performance path. Airtightness is from my experience, airtightness in windows are the easiest path forward to success. So a 2x6 wall with an R22 bat with windows under 1 and airtightness under 1 likely will allow anybody in climate zone 3 to comply to step 3 with some very minor additional alterations. This is not as difficult as people think. So what were some of the successes that we saw or led to the successful adoption in British Columbia, some of which we've talked about, but having a mandatory builder licensing program with CPD requirements already in place really made it easy to force those individuals who were reluctant to adopt to take education specific to this. And in fact, a year or so ago, the education requirements were changed slightly to require that as part of your CPD every year, you have to take CPD that is specific to energy step code. We already had in British Columbia a pretty strong adoption of energy labels. I think the Lower Mainland in British Columbia has been a hotbed of passive house development for a long time. So not only did we have a culture, within the building group to act as leaders and show people how to do this, municipalities had some understanding of how this worked. And of course, this had driven capacity building around making sure there were enough energy advisors as this was adopted in Lower Mainland, that there were enough people to satisfy the needs of a performance-based approach. I talked about before the municipalities that were already requiring high levels of energy efficiency. Energy advisor capacity. And then we had this broad spectrum of industry and government engagement at the very, very beginning. And so as you go down this path, I can't say enough about how important it is to get everybody around the table, listen to people's concerns, work with your stakeholders to get to consensus so everybody sees how this works and what the path forward is. I think, interestingly, we started the step code path with a Liberal government. Partway through the development of the standard, we had an election and we had a completely new government that came into place, and there wasn't a single bump. The NDP picked up from where the Liberal vision was on this and continued it forward. So really, really good support from the provincial government. And I think a very, very strong commitment to make sure this was successful. As I noted before, they clearly understood the failure of the 2010 adoption, and they pulled out all the stops to make sure that as the step code was released, that this would be a success, not just in the Lower Mainland, but we were flexible to ensure that builders in Surrey, as well as builders in Fort St. John, were all given an opportunity to be successful on this. So that's all from me, and open up to questions.
Thanks so much there. If you just want to stop sharing your screen, that'd be super helpful. So I've got myself and Kevin have been added the spotlights so you can see us. And we've already got some nice questions happening in the chat. Here in the chat, we've got a question. Does this housing initiative address affordable housing strategies? Sorry. Does the BC Housing Initiative address affordable housing strategies? That's to you, Bob.
So interestingly, I'm working with another builder who's been building Part 9 multi-unit residential buildings. Been in the business for 20 plus years on the energy efficient high performance building front. Zebex is a group out of UBC, just did an analysis of a building that he recently built. He built the building actually it was part 3 building. So built it to a net zero standard so step 5 for 30% less than what they identified a code minimum building could be built for. So, part of the advantage of looking at a performance approach to building buildings is it gives you options in terms of optimizing the level of energy efficiency that you need to achieve. So there are 2 ways to do this. You can throw stuff at the wall, particularly on a prescriptive approach, and you can spend a lot of money. You can work with people who understand how to do this, reaching across the country to people who have expertise in this, and you can build very affordable buildings that perform incredibly well. This building that I'm referring to, the energy costs are so low that they actually include and it's an all electric building. Your monthly energy costs are included in your strata fees, and the strata fees in this particular building are 30% less than the strata fees across the street. So there's a really good example of how you create affordability in a multi-unit residential building.
Thanks. Okay, so the next question is also for Bob. So who initiated the Step Code Council in BC? What were the key organizations that got on board early?
So the Step Code Council, I think, was really an evolution of the committee that was in charge of the implementation. So we started off with 2 different groups, one focusing on Part 9 buildings and one focusing on Part 3. Those 2 groups created the Step Code standard for those 2 different types of construction. And then those 2 groups came together to form a larger committee for implementation. And as an outcome of the implementation, it was decided that a Step Code Council was important to the successful adoption. And so essentially the members of the implementation committee became the Step Code Council.
Okay, thank you. So since Vancouver has its own charter, I can understand how that fact helped adopt higher standards independently of the province. What factor or factors helped in other municipalities?
So if I just let me know if I'm answering the question correctly. So yes, City of Vancouver, on their mission to become the greenest city on the planet, was really a bit of a canary in the coal mine. They made some pretty good mistakes. And so that really did help inform us as we looked to create the standard. The City of Vancouver is still certainly out in front, throwing stuff against the wall to see what sticks. So that it gives us a continuing opportunity to learn. As an extension of the Step Code Council, there is a peer network, which is most of the big municipalities have a forum where they get together to talk together about what's working for them and what's not working. And so that's been very, very helpful as an information sharing network. And interestingly, I think while I've never participated in one of those peer network meetings, it's actually created some cross communication on all things municipal. And I've heard feedback from the people that sit in that group that while it was set up to help with the successful adoption of the Step Code, it's actually helping them address all kinds of other issues that they experience on a day-to-day basis. So, this has had some unintended successful outcomes as well.
If I can jump in for a second, I think two other factors that I think are important are the role of Clean BC played in setting targets and accountability, and helping to drive some of those changes in recognizing the role emissions play. But Bob, also I guess the weather or climate in BC and events over the last few years have really galvanized support around reducing energy use and emissions as well.
Yes, I mean, we had the worst year ever with forest fires, and then followed, before everybody had even started to recover from the forest fires, we had the worst floods in ever. Worst floods in Canada.
Yeah, weather. Ugh. So we've just added here Joe Casper from the province of Manitoba, who's just going to help give a little bit more Manitoba specific context to that question about charters and municipalities. Thanks, Joe.
No problem. As always, thanks for the invite to allow us to be at the table to help provide some clarification. So one of the differences that we have from Manitoba and BC is Manitoba's legislation does not actually allow municipalities to establish construction standards per se. It is only the Governor General that has the power to establish construction standards within the province. So even through bylaws and such, RMs are not allowed to establish more restrictive sort of construction requirements. And this varies throughout all the provinces and territories in Canada. We see some provinces that allow, they'll set sort of a base minimum, and RMs and such can kind of expand upon those. And then there's some provinces that don't allow any sort of changes. So the current legislation that we have right now would be that the Manitoba Building Code and the Manitoba Energy Code would sort of be what is the code for all across Manitoba, and no RMs can sort of establish any differences. And when we're talking sort of tier setting codes that are coming up fairly quickly and will be under review by the province, that is stuff that we'll have to take into consideration. Knowing that the way that the national document was written was sort of to allow sort of AHJs to establish what tier they're going to shoot for, and just food for thought.
So if I could just respond to that. So BC has exactly the same regulation. Municipalities are not allowed to interpret the building code or supplement the code today with additional requirements for energy efficiency. And that was really the foundation of the Energy Step Code, to create a framework within that regulation that would enable municipalities to choose a level of the step code that best suited where they were at today. And so, Joe, it would be interesting for you guys to, have a look at how that regulatory framework was set up in British Columbia, and, whether that would be a fit for Manitoba, given that, both provinces really started in the same place.
Yeah, and that's something that we would take into consideration with our review of the code. As Manitoba's Pennypack representative, I would sort of bounce things off my counterpart there in BC to get some of that background information, knowing that a lot of the energy stuff, BC is really leading the charge on that. So anything to do with energy, a lot of the provinces, we really tap into BC because they've been kind of the front runners, similar to Manitoba has been kind of a front runner on accessibility. BC is really the energy guys to go out to.
Okay, so the next question's coming in from Alex. Is there any discussion on industry or the regulation side around ensuring that buildings built to meet the lower tiers of the STEP code are easily upgradable to the higher tiers in the future?
No, I don't. Yes, I mean, therein lies. Yeah, so the risk in being slow to adoption is you're creating a legacy. You're continuing to create a legacy of poor performing buildings, and you have to balance that out against the capacity you have in your industry for successful construction of buildings that work. So you need to move quickly, but you have to be conscious of making sure that you pull everybody along in a way that you're continuing to build safe buildings, safe, healthy buildings. Education, education, education.
Okay, so the next, and if ever I start reading the next question, just jump in if you have something to add, everybody else. So related to those climate events noted, can you speak to the STEP code and adaptation?
So adaptation was not really considered in the development of the STEP code. It really was specific to energy efficiency. Adaptation, of course, particularly in light of what happened last year, is becoming more and more of a conversation piece and a concern. Floods and wildfires. But it is a separate piece. It doesn't mean that you can't weave some of those things together. Kevin, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess there is as Bob mentioned, there's no specific focus on adaptation, but the focus on the building envelope. I think that speaks to potential adaptation. You're not locking in a poor performing building from the structure in, and so that provides a benefit in terms of adaptation, and yeah, and then upgradable as well. As if you're retrofitting the building in 10, 20 years and don't have to disassemble or the entire building envelope, then that's one more measure towards keeping those resources within the structure instead of the landfill, and hopefully not having to add the complexity of adding insulation to an existing structure.
Thank you. So Joe, we've got a question for you from Cindy. So would Manitoba consider allowing a relaunch of the Building Code Standards Board again, perhaps a STEP Code Council?
Well, I don't know if that's necessarily a question I could answer. In the past, yes, Manitoba did have a building standards board. The direction of government during that during the 2016 year where it was dismantled was to sort of decommission as many boards and councils as possible. That was sort of the flavor then. We haven't heard anything different. These are questions that the department itself is sort of bringing up with the current review of the 2020 code cycle. If government has a taste for establishing a new building standards boards or subsequently other standing committees with technical matters. So currently we don't have any future direction on it, but from a department stand, that is something that we are currently exploring if that position has changed.
And I just, I can comment here. Our experience in 2010 was a top down, was very unsuccessful. The adoption today has been a bottom up. So creating lines of communication, both across and up and down, is so important. And, interestingly, my comment on the peer network, where municipalities now have created this communication channel that allows them to not only talk about STEP code, but all things that impact their daily basis. And so, just an interesting side benefit of that development. So yeah, communication is key.
So Bob, the term we use often is a big tent. We pitch a big tent and bring everybody in. And while doing that with the stakeholder council, were there obvious detractors within that council, and how did that work out in terms of moving the STEP code forward?
Yeah, we did. We had a very limited number of people who were aggressive detractors. And interestingly, you may have noticed that NECB has 4 steps and MBC has 5. Well, that really was as a result of, one particular group who was on the Part 9 side was very, very negative about the unintended, the consequences of cost and, the difficulty in capacity building. And so to try and address those concerns, we added a 5th step for Part 9, which was step 2 at 10%. And so, that the group really did try to listen to people and address concerns. One of the interesting things is that virtually nobody has adopted step 2. They've gone from 1 to 3, but that wasn't an attempt to be inclusive and build consensus. And in the end, it didn't create any harm. And there are going to be people who are afraid and are going to battle against it. But by being inclusive and listening to people, most people you can get on board. So I noted Kamlib's and Kelowna initially, they lobbied very aggressively against their local government, to not adopt, and they were successful in the early stages as they prevented their local governments from adopting step code. We got them into the tent. We listened to the concerns they had. One of the interesting outcomes was one of the guys who was leading the charge against this. I convinced him to get a blower door test on one of his new houses. I think he scored under 1.5, and you have never seen somebody who was so proud of what they built, because all of a sudden he discovered, I do a good job. And when you look at performance approaches, that can be very validating for people to pat themselves in the back and go, actually, I'm doing a great job. And so, that turned him around as an influencer very, very quickly, because he was doing it. He just didn't know it.
Thank you for sharing. So I see no more questions in the chat, but I was wondering, Joe, if you could take a moment to just share with us all of what we can expect next year in Manitoba on this road to adoption.
All right. Well, as everyone's aware, Manitoba is straggling behind, unfortunately, on code adoptions. We're still looking at adopting the 2015 code. We're currently, the regs are finalized. They're going through what's called a RAC submission as part of red tape reduction and such, and accountability. So we anticipate that those will be posted for public engagement fairly shortly. We'll definitely be reaching out to specific stakeholders, including this group, notifying them that it will be posted for 45 days. Upon feedback from that, we would go ahead with the adoption of the 2015 codes. The 2015s are going to be considered sort of a step code into the 2020. So they won't be around for long, but going from 2010 to 2020 is quite a leap, especially from a design perspective, to get people used to the design aspects of from 2017 to 2020. So what we'll see is more than likely an adoption within this year, and an enforcement more than likely, an enforcement date more likely a fall would be the department's suggestions. Once again, these are subject to government approvals. Upon that, we'll be looking at, we have a signed RCT agreement, which basically states that we plan to adopt the 2020s within a 24-month cycle. That would be late March of 2024. We're not sure yet what we're looking at for the phase or the tier approach on energy and everything else. This is all stuff that is going to happen within this code review process. Unfortunately, from a government perspective, we don't get access to the codes much sooner than the public does. I think I had a week or 2 week window to view some of it from a pity pack standpoint. But even then, we don't really see the finalized versions. We have an idea of what's going to come down, but a lot of that's debated with CCPS along the way. So right now, we're actively working on 2, and there'll be public engagement and consultation with regards to the 2020 code cycles and phase energy approach and what that'll look like in the future.
Just one comment, when Kevin and I presented to Nova Scotia in 2020, they had actually done an analysis of where the industry was at. And in the Halifax area, there was an energy label, Kevin, I can't remember what it was, that had a high level of adoption. And they actually discovered, much to their surprise, that I think close to 70% of their housing stock was actually complying with step 3 already. And so that was presented to that stakeholder group when we were there. And people were very surprised because, again, people are very concerned with the cost consequences and their ability to be successful. And so, Joe, I don't know if anybody has had a look at, where the existing industry is at today. Do you have data from, labeling and performance path approaches that people are doing to get a better idea of, where is your baseline? Is it way behind, or are the builders doing a better job?
I have a feeling Manitoba would be behind in Part 9 housing, definitely. Knowing that with the adoption, with the introduction of 936, there were specific amendments that were done at the time that amended the NRC's R values to what I would consider less. So I think they more or less amended them to keep construction the same, in my professional opinion. So we're already lacking in that aspect, and that's typically where we see some pushback, and as most people do, is in Part 9 housing. We don't see huge issues in Part 3 large commercial buildings, because it's when you're spending millions of dollars on buildings, it's not hard to argue savings over the overall life of a building. We find it really in housing where it is specifically profit driven sort of construction. So we'll have to start, part of this process will be looking into what the current, what the availability is and what's being done out there, but there's going to be probably some significant changes, I would think, in the construction industry for housing.
Well, I'm going to try and sneak in one last question, if that's okay. AHJs in Manitoba have been putting more of the compliance acknowledgements on the architects and consulting engineers and less towards inspections. How will the model code support compliance while still working within ever decreasing operation budgets capacities?
Yeah, so the model codes themselves, or the framework for the model codes, don't necessarily address compliance, but it's within those other I guess regulatory movements that I mentioned, like the Net Zero Building Code Acceleration Fund. That's within the green building strategy, and recognition, I think, within government that compliance is key to the success of the codes and realizing actual reductions versus, say, modeled.
I suppose I can add that, you know, if a builder follows the performance path, then your energy advisor can become a great partner for the HJs to validate compliance within that performance model. And certainly KC, the Consulting Association of Energy Advisors, which is the national association that is growing, is really looking to elevate the level of professionalism and trust that AHJs can have with energy advisors, so that they can become one of those key partners to help municipalities with an adoption that potentially does create more work for them.
And if I could add to that too, I think it's important to understand the roles of building officials and designers. And sometimes those get confusing. Building officials never really have the capacity, or it is within their role to sort of guarantee code compliance. They sort of operate in an audit function. The permit's sort of an audit function to the best of their ability, and the inspection's sort of an audit function. A lot of the design components do lie with the designers. When we're dealing with energy compliance and stuff and the design, a lot of that is being relied upon, as the question states, on the designer as the responsibility of the designer and under the bearer of their seal. Basically what the building official is sort of doing in that is auditing that role and checking for, you know, does this seem legit? And when they're doing an inspection isn't a guarantee as well, right? At the end of the day, the people doing the work have a responsibility to build the code. The designers have a responsibility to design the code. The building inspector is going through, hopefully catching, you know, things that would be blatant code infractions, but necessarily they're not going to catch everything. If a building inspector walks out and a designer or a contractor goes, it passed, that's a red flag, because it's necessarily, well, just because they didn't see it doesn't mean he passed your non-compliant work. If you're aware your work is non-compliant, the onus lies with the person. If it's something that's blatant and being sort of neglected by the inspector, that's sort of different. But on a high level, the inspector is really acting as an audit function, a sort of unbiased third-party person in the process of ensuring code compliance, if that makes sense. So when it comes to stuff like mechanical design and all of these things, they're very complex stuff that really is relied a lot on that designer. And the inspector or the building official is really just looking at it and looking for sort of blatant things, or, you know, eye pokers that might stick out, and questioning that designer. Well, why did you do this, or why doesn't do this? And waiting for the response for the designer to see if everything's copacetic, if that makes sense.
And maybe I just segue that to just highlight that, you know, when you're reaching out for education, it is the architects, and, you know, particularly the architects are a key group that needs to appreciate that they have to look at buildings in a different way. When you talk about cost for compliance for energy performance, the number one component is design. So an architect can design a building that is generally low cost for energy performance, and they can design a building that will drive extraordinary cost. And I think one of the outcomes in BC that I've noticed is that we have not done a great job in engaging architects around how what are the materials and what are the design strategies that drive cost-effective construction. So that's your challenge.
Well, there's been so much incredible information shared today, so much good food for thought. I want to thank all three of you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge and insights. And I just want to thank everybody who took some time today to listen to these experts, and hopefully we can integrate these into how we're doing things in Manitoba and stop being dead last in Canada in code adoption. And to that point, for those people who want to get a little bit more into the advocacy side of things, the organization Kevin's with, Efficiency Canada, will be hosting a session on the 18th about code adoption. And so you can absolutely sign up and attend that. You can find that on their website. As well as I put it in the email I sent out today about the link to remind everybody. So yeah, and of course you can always get in touch with Sustainable Building Manitoba about code adoption and implementation, as well as anything else sustainable building related here in Manitoba. So again, a huge thank you to everyone. And I hope that you go out and have yourself a great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invite.
Thank you.